The words sliced through the dining hall noise like a blade through silk. "You don't belong in this line, lady." Staff Sergeant Brett Callahan's voice carried absolute certainty, the kind that comes from someone who's never been told no. His face contorted into a sneer that had nothing to do with physical features and everything to do with the contempt blazing in his eyes. The shove came immediately. Callahan didn't just bump into her. He planted his muscular shoulder, honed from countless hours at the gym, directly into her upper arm with calculated force. It was the kind of aggressive move designed to establish dominance, to make crystal clear who held power in this moment. The kind of move made by someone who'd never faced real consequences for his behavior. The woman stood in the lunch line at Camp Sterling's main dining facility, holding a standard plastic tray. She wore civilian attire, a charcoal gray athletic pullover and practical khaki cargo pants. Her dark auburn hair was pulled into a simple braid, and her face bore the healthy flush of someone who'd been exercising in the crisp autumn air. She displayed no visible insignia, no rank, no authority badges. To anyone observing, she appeared exactly as Callahan assumed, a civilian, perhaps a military spouse or contractor, who'd wandered into the wrong place. But she didn't fall. When Callahan's shoulder connected with her arm, she adjusted her weight with the fluid grace of someone who'd maintained peak physical conditioning for 2 decades. Her hiking boots shifted position by mere inches. She caught the serving counter's edge with her left hand, firm but not panicked, and simply stabilized. The tray in her right hand remained perfectly level, not even a single ice cube shifting in her water glass. She didn't gasp, didn't cry out, didn't look shocked or frightened. Instead, she took a slow, deliberate breath, straightened her posture, and turned her head to look directly at the man who'd just shoved her. Callahan was an imposing figure. 6 feet 2 inches, 220 pounds of muscle wrapped in desert camouflage. His head was shaved to regulation perfection, sleeves rolled with obsessive precision, showing forearms marked with a fading eagle, globe, and anchor tattoo. His name tape read Callahan across his chest in regulation black letters. He had the swagger of someone who'd never questioned his own dominance, who'd never met someone who didn't immediately defer to his size, his rank, or his attitude. The 2 lance corporals flanking him, barely old enough to drink legally, were already snickering, eyes bright with anticipation of watching someone get put in their place. They'd seen Callahan do this before. He was always testing people, always asserting dominance, always ensuring everyone knew exactly where they stood in his personal hierarchy. "This is a chow hall for Marines," Callahan announced, his voice pitched loud enough to carry across the entire facility. The clatter of silverware and low conversation seemed to pause as heads began turning. He was enjoying this, the attention, the power dynamic he was creating. Not for civilians wandering in off the street looking for a free meal. He stepped closer, invading her personal space in that deliberate way bullies do when they want to intimidate. Up close, she could smell the gun oil and sweat clinging to his uniform, the acrid scent of a man who'd spent the morning on the range without bothering to clean up. "You look like you got lost on the way to the mall," he continued, his eyes raking over her gray pullover and cargo pants with obvious disdain. "This isn't a place for tourists. We've got real warriors here, men who've earned the right to eat. Maybe you should try the commissary, or better yet, get yourself a nice salad from some civilian establishment in town." The woman looked at him with an expression that was difficult to read. Her blue eyes, sharp and clear, with the peculiar intensity of someone who'd seen difficult things, didn't show fear. They didn't show anger or defensiveness either. They showed something that might have been patience or possibly disappointment, but certainly not intimidation. "Excuse me, Sergeant," she said. Her voice was low, the kind of quiet that makes people lean in to listen. There was no tremor in it, no uncertainty. It was the kind of voice that came from someone accustomed to being obeyed, though she was clearly making an effort to keep her tone civil. "I am in line for lunch. The sign outside says, "All hands welcome until 1300 hours. It is currently 12:47. I am entitled to be here." The dining facility went quieter. Not silent. There was still the background noise of utensils against trays and low conversation, but quieter. Several Marines at nearby tables paused mid-bite, forks hovering near their mouths, sensing that something was shifting in the dynamic. What Callahan did next would seal his fate, but he had no idea yet. Quick pause before we continue. If you're watching this from somewhere in the world right now, let me know in the comments. I read every single one. And if you're enjoying stories like this, make sure to hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell, because tomorrow's episode, it goes even deeper than this. Callahan laughed, a harsh, barking sound that echoed off the metal serving counters. He looked back at his two junior Marines with the expression of someone who'd just heard the funniest thing imaginable. "Did you hear that? She's quoting policy at me. She thinks a piece of paper is going to change how this works." He turned back to her, his chest puffing out further, effectively blocking her access to the serving line entirely. "Listen here, lady. I don't know who your husband is. I don't know if he's a warrant officer or a captain or what. Honestly, I don't care. But I've been out on that range since dawn. We've got a training schedule and my Marines are hungry. This line is for the working party. We've been in the field for 8 hours. You, on the other hand, look like you've spent the morning at a spa." He paused, letting his words sink in. "So here's how this is going to work. You're going to step aside. You're going to wait until we're finished. And then, if there's anything left, maybe you can grab something." The woman didn't step aside. Staff Sergeant Brett Callahan's face flushed a deep crimson. It wasn't the kind of blush that comes from embarrassment. It was the angry red of wounded pride. He'd expected immediate capitulation. He'd expected her to apologize, to shrink back, to scurry away like everyone else did when he decided to assert his dominance. The fact that she'd not only refused to move, but had the audacity to cite policy at him, felt like a personal affront. "Oh, I see," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. He turned to his two lance corporals, shaking his head in mock amazement. "She knows the regulations. How impressive. I'm sure the commanding officer would love to know that we have a civilian expert on military protocol wandering around his installation." He turned back to her, and his demeanor shifted. The false humor drained away, replaced by something harder, meaner. This was the moment where Callahan always escalated. This was where he stopped playing and started hurting. "Let me explain something to you, since you clearly don't understand how things work here," he said, stepping even closer, so close that she could feel the heat radiating off his body. "That sign outside? That's for actual military personnel. That's for people who contribute to this base. That's for Marines who sweat, who bleed, who sacrifice, not for people who tag along because they married someone with a uniform." His words were delivered with surgical precision, designed to wound. He paused between sentences, letting each barb land fully before throwing the next one. "You want to know what I see when I look at you?" he continued, his lip curling into a sneer. "I see someone who doesn't belong. I see someone who's never done a day of hard work in their entire life. I see someone who probably spends their days at the officers' club drinking wine and complaining about military life while my Marines are out there getting shot at. And you have the nerve to stand here and lecture me about regulations." One of the lance corporals laughed, a nervous, uncertain sound that suggested he was less comfortable with this situation than his senior NCO. But Callahan didn't notice, or didn't care. He was on a roll now, feeding off his own anger, building momentum like a storm system gaining strength over warm water. But what he didn't know was that across the room, someone had just recognized exactly who he was attacking. At a table positioned near the beverage dispensers, approximately 30 feet away from the confrontation, Lance Corporal Tyler Brennan sat frozen mid-chew on his turkey sandwich. His eyes had been tracking the situation from the moment Callahan first made contact with the woman, and his stomach had been twisting tighter with each passing second. He hated Callahan. Everyone in Charlie Company hated Callahan. The man was the kind of leader who confused brutality with strength, who screamed at privates for minor infractions while somehow always managing to avoid real consequences for his own failings. But Brennan wasn't watching Callahan. His entire attention was fixed on the woman in the gray pullover. There was something about her, something familiar in a way that Brennan couldn't immediately place. He squinted, trying to work through the fog of recognition. He'd seen her before. He was absolutely certain of that. But not here. Not in person. Not in this dining facility at Camp Sterling. He'd seen her somewhere else, in a context that was slowly trying to surface from the depths of his memory. The long auburn hair in a braid threw him off initially. In his mind, the person he was thinking of had worn their hair differently, pulled back tight, hidden away under a regulation cover. But the profile was unmistakable once he looked for it. The way she held her chin, the particular angle of her jaw, the absolute stillness of her posture, the kind of calm that suggested she'd been trained to remain motionless for extended periods under stress. The efficient way she moved, economical and precise with no wasted motion. Brennan set down his sandwich slowly, his appetite completely evaporating. He leaned back in his chair, his eyes narrowing as he studied her more carefully. Where had he seen her? His buddy, Corporal Cole Patterson, sitting across from him, noticed the sudden change in Brennan's demeanor. "Dude, what's wrong? You look like you've seen a ghost," Patterson said, following Brennan's line of sight. "Oh, is that the thing with Callahan and the civilian? Yeah, that's pretty messed up. Apparently she's not even supposed to be in here or something. Callahan's about to call it in." Brennan barely heard him. His mind was racing, trying to place the memory. There was something about the wrist, he thought suddenly. His eyes dropped to her right wrist. She was wearing a simple black memorial bracelet, the kind that soldiers wore to honor fallen comrades. It was made of black metal, scuffed and worn down to silver on the edges from constant contact with skin, sweat, and the elements. The kind of bracelet that someone wore every single day, that they never took off, that was as much a part of their uniform as the insignia on their collar. Brennan's breath caught in his throat. He leaned forward, his eyes widening. The bracelet combined with everything else he was seeing, the bearing, the composure under stress, the way she'd resisted Callahan without ever showing a hint of fear, suddenly clicked into place in his mind like a key turning in a lock. "Oh my God," he whispered. "What?" Patterson asked, confused. "What is it?" Brennan didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked away from the woman and toward the wall near the entrance of the dining facility. There was usually a section there where the command staff photos were displayed. The chain of command for the installation, the senior leadership, the faces and names of the people who technically made all the decisions around this base. The photos weren't visible from his current position, but he didn't need to see them. He remembered the briefing from 3 days ago, the orientation meeting they'd been forced to attend for all the junior enlisted. The slideshow presentation about the unit's history, the installation's mission, the new command structure that had been implemented just last week. His eyes widened further. There had been a photograph. He'd barely paid attention at the time. Most of the Marines in the room had been checking their watches, waiting for the briefing to end so they could get back to their duties. But he remembered one image in particular. A woman in dress blues, her uniform immaculate, medals and ribbons covering her chest, stars on her collar. She had the same auburn hair, the same profile, the same eyes, the same exact bearing. Brigadier General Margaret Thornton, the new deputy commanding general for the entire installation. The woman who'd been brought in to oversee operations, to improve readiness, to restore discipline and standards to the base. She'd arrived only a week prior, and most of the junior enlisted personnel had barely seen her except in photographs and official briefings. "Holy shit," Brennan breathed, his sandwich completely forgotten. Patterson nudged him under the table. "Okay, seriously, what is going on with you? You're freaking me out." "The bracelet," Brennan said urgently, his voice barely above a whisper. "Look at the bracelet on her wrist." Patterson squinted, trying to see what Brennan was seeing from their distance across the room. "She's wearing a KIA bracelet. I mean, lots of people wear those. Doesn't necessarily mean—" "Not just any bracelet," Brennan interrupted, already scrambling out of his chair. His movement was sudden enough that he knocked his plastic tray, and it clattered against the table, drawing momentary attention from several nearby Marines. He didn't care. He was already moving toward the exit, his mind running through the calculations, the possibilities, the implications of what he was witnessing. Patterson grabbed his arm. "Dude, what are you doing? Where are you going?" "I have to make a call," Brennan said, his voice trembling with barely suppressed urgency. "If that's who I think it is, if Callahan just did what I think he did, he's about to commit career suicide. Career as in it's going to be over, finished, done. And I'm not going to be standing next to him when the lightning bolt hits." What Brennan was about to set in motion would change everything. But back at the serving line, Callahan was still digging his grave deeper. Back at the serving line, Callahan was far from finished with his tirade. "You know what? I don't even think you're a spouse," he said, tilting his head as if studying her more closely. "You're probably some contractor, some civilian company rep who thinks you can waltz into a military facility and act like you own the place. Well, this is the United States Marine Corps, lady. We have standards here. We have discipline. We have a chain of command. And you are at the bottom of that chain. Below private, below recruit. You're nothing here." The dining facility had definitely gone quieter now. It was the kind of quiet that happens when a large group of people realize they're witnessing something that's about to go very wrong. Several tables of junior Marines, privates and lance corporals mostly, had turned to watch openly. Their forks had stopped moving. Their conversations had died away. This was a train wreck in slow motion, and nobody could look away. What struck many of them, though they wouldn't have been able to articulate it clearly, was the disparity in reactions. Callahan was red-faced, veins standing out on his neck, his entire body radiating barely controlled aggression. The woman in the gray pullover was perfectly still. Her expression hadn't changed. She wasn't crying, she wasn't trembling, she wasn't showing any of the signs of fear or distress that Callahan was clearly trying to provoke. That calm infuriated him even more. "And another thing," Callahan said, his voice rising loud enough to carry across the entire dining facility. He was performing for an audience now, whether he fully realized it or not. "The fact that you're even attempting to argue with me shows a complete lack of respect for rank and authority. You know what happens to people who disrespect a non-commissioned officer in this Corps. We have consequences for that. We have the Uniform Code of Military Justice. We have. You have the ability to read." The woman interrupted quietly. The words were spoken so softly that for a moment Callahan wasn't sure he'd actually heard them. He blinked, his mouth hanging open slightly, his momentum completely derailed. "Excuse me," he said, his voice dangerous now in a different way. This wasn't the bluster of someone enjoying power anymore. This was the tone of someone who felt genuinely threatened, and that made it worse. "I said you have the ability to read," she repeated, her voice still calm and low. "That sign outside says all hands." That's a direct quote from Regulation 1234.7, subsection C, which clearly states that all personnel assigned to or visiting the installation are welcome to utilize dining facilities during posted hours. It doesn't say all Marines, it says all hands. That would include civilian contractors, spouses, and visiting personnel. She paused, letting that sink in. "So either you don't know your own base regulations, Sergeant, or you're choosing to ignore them. Neither option reflects well on your leadership. There was a collective intake of breath across the dining facility. Several Marines' eyes widened. One private nearly choked on his food. The two lance corporals behind Callahan exchanged nervous glances, their earlier amusement completely evaporated. Callahan's face went from red to purple. The vein in his temple was now visibly pulsing, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. "You do not talk to me like that," he snarled. "You do not lecture me about regulations in front of my Marines. That is insubordination. That is disrespect of a non-commissioned officer. And I don't care if you're a spouse, a contractor, or the Queen of England. You are going to apologize, and you are going to get out of this chow hall immediately." He reached out and grabbed the serving counter, his knuckles going white with the intensity of his grip. For a moment, it looked like he might actually flip the entire thing over. "In fact," he said, his breathing heavy now, his words coming out in sharp, clipped sentences, "I'm done asking nicely. You are trespassing. You are disrupting military operations. You are interfering with the readiness of my Marines. I am ordering you to leave this facility immediately. And if you refuse, I will have no choice but to call the military police and have you escorted out. Is that clear?" The woman looked at him. Her expression was still completely calm, but something had shifted in her eyes. It was subtle, just a slight hardening at the edges, but it was there. It was the look of someone who had just made a decision about how this was going to end. "Sergeant Callahan," she said, her voice dropping even lower, taking on a quality that seemed to vibrate with something deeper than mere authority, "you are making a mistake, a very significant mistake, and you are doing it in front of witnesses." "Is that a threat?" Callahan demanded, stepping closer still, his chest heaving with barely controlled rage. "It's a promise," she said simply. And something in the way she said it, something in the absolute certainty in her voice, something in the way she held his gaze without flinching, made several of the watching Marines shift uncomfortably in their seats. They didn't understand why yet, but they all felt it. Something fundamental had just shifted in this confrontation. And then Callahan made his final, fatal mistake. Staff Sergeant Brett Callahan moved to physically remove her from the line. It wasn't a gentle guiding hand on the elbow. It was an aggressive grab, his large hand wrapping around her upper arm with enough force that his fingers dug into the fabric of her gray pullover. He was going to drag her out of this line if he had to, and he didn't particularly care who watched. In his mind, she had crossed a line by questioning his authority, by challenging him in front of his Marines, by refusing to simply comply with his demands. Physical removal had become inevitable in his escalating logic. "Let's go," he growled, attempting to pull her away from the serving counter. "You're done here, time to leave." But she didn't move. It was like trying to drag a statue that had been bolted to the deck. Her feet remained planted exactly where they were, her weight distributed evenly, her center of gravity perfectly centered. Callahan pulled harder, expecting at least some forward momentum, some sign of resistance that he could overcome with his superior size and strength. Instead, he got nothing. She simply stood there immovable, as if his physical effort was utterly irrelevant to her. For the first time, confusion flickered across Callahan's face. This wasn't how people responded when he grabbed them. People typically stumbled forward, yelped, tried to wrench their arm away. They showed fear or panic or anger, something that acknowledged his dominance. This woman did none of those things. "I said move," he repeated, this time putting his full body weight into the pull. His feet actually skidded slightly on the polished floor of the dining facility as he tried to generate enough leverage to move her. Still nothing. The Marines watching had gone completely silent now. The ambient noise of the dining facility, the clink of silverware, the murmur of conversation, the scrape of chairs, seemed to have died away entirely. Every eye in the room was fixed on the confrontation unfolding at the serving line. What had started as an amusing display of a senior NCO putting a civilian in her place had transformed into something else entirely, something unexpected, something that didn't fit the established narrative of power and dominance that Callahan had been constructing. A private first class named Kenneth Torres, sitting at a table near the middle of the room, leaned over to his buddy, a lance corporal named Austin Fisher. Is she just not moving?" Torres whispered, his eyes still locked on the scene. Fisher nodded slowly, his fork frozen halfway to his mouth. "Yeah, he's pulling with everything he's got and she's not budging an inch. I've never seen anything like that." What neither of them understood was that the woman in the gray pullover had spent the better part of 20 years learning exactly how to stand her ground. Not through brute force. She would never win a pure strength competition against someone like Callahan, but through leverage, through understanding the mechanics of balance and weight distribution, through years of training that had taught her how to make her body an immovable object when necessary. Callahan, meanwhile, was running out of options. He couldn't drag her. He couldn't intimidate her. His verbal assaults weren't landing the way they normally did. His entire playbook for dominating people seemed to be ineffective against this single, calm woman in hiking boots. He released her arm, stepping back slightly, his chest heaving. His face was slick with sweat now, not just from exertion, but from the stress of the situation spiraling beyond his control. His jaw clenched and unclenched as he tried to figure out his next move. "You know what?" he said, his voice taking on a different quality now, still aggressive but with an undertone of something else. Desperation, maybe, or fear disguised as anger. "I don't know what your deal is, but you're not eating in this facility today, and if you try to cause any more trouble, I'm calling the MPs right now. You understand me? Military police, real law enforcement, and they will remove you. They will remove you, and they'll cite you for trespassing on a military installation without authorization." The two lance corporals behind him shuffled nervously. One of them, a kid who couldn't have been more than 22 years old, looked genuinely uncomfortable with how this was progressing. He'd signed up to follow Callahan's lead when it meant hassling other junior Marines or doing push-ups as punishment for minor infractions. But this felt different. This felt like they'd crossed some kind of line that he couldn't quite articulate. "Sergeant," one of them said hesitantly, "maybe we should just—" "Shut it," Callahan snapped, not even looking at him. His eyes were locked on the woman, studying her face as if trying to find some weakness he could exploit. "I'm not finished here." He stepped closer again, invading her personal space once more. This time, though, his approach was different. He wasn't trying to physically overpower her anymore. Instead, he was trying something else. Intimidation through proximity, through the sheer weight of his presence, through the assertion of his authority. "Let me make something very clear to you," he said, his voice low enough that only she could hear him clearly, though the silence in the dining facility meant that most of the room caught at least fragments of his words. "I don't know who you think you are. I don't care how much money your family has. I don't care if your husband is an officer. None of that matters here. What matters is that you are an MY establishment on MY time, disrupting MY Marines' meal, and you need to leave, now." He was breathing heavily, his nostrils flaring with each breath. A vein pulsed visibly in his temple. His hands were clenched so tightly that the knuckles had gone white. "You have exactly two options," he continued. "Option 1, you walk out of here right now with your dignity intact, and we can forget this whole thing ever happened. You never come back to this chow hall. You make arrangements to eat elsewhere, and life goes on. Option 2, you refuse to leave and I make a call to the military police. They escort you out in cuffs. Your name goes on a report. Your family finds out about your little incident, and you become a problem on this installation." He leaned in even closer, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "So what's it going to be, lady? Are you going to walk out of here and save yourself some embarrassment, or are you going to keep pushing me?" The woman looked at him. Her blue eyes were perfectly steady, perfectly calm. There was no anger in them. There was no fear. What was there was something more unsettling to Callahan. There was pity. There was the look of someone observing a dog that didn't understand it was about to walk off a cliff. "Sergeant Callahan," she said quietly, "you should stop talking now." "Or what?" he challenged, his voice rising again. "What are you going to do about it? Call your husband? Call the chaplain? Call the base commander's office?" He laughed, a harsh, bitter sound. "Because none of that is going to help you. I am the authority in this Chow Hall. I am the ranking Marine here. My word is law in this space, and my word is that you don't belong here." He reached out again, this time not grabbing, but gesturing sharply toward the exit. "Get out, now. I'm not asking any more." The woman adjusted her stance slightly, widening her base of support. It was a subtle movement, barely noticeable to anyone who wasn't trained to observe such things, but it was significant. She had just shifted from a defensive posture to something else entirely. She had made a decision about how this was going to end, and that decision had nothing to do with leaving. "I'm going to get my lunch," she said, her voice dropping an octave, taking on a quality that seemed to resonate through the entire dining facility, cutting through the tension like a knife. "And you are going to step aside." It was the same thing she'd said before, but something had changed in the delivery. The authority that had been only hinted at before was now present in full force. It was the kind of command voice that came from someone accustomed to being obeyed, someone who had issued orders in circumstances where lives depended on people following those orders immediately and without question. Callahan blinked. For just a fraction of a second, his certainty wavered. But his pride wouldn't let him back down, not now, not in front of all these Marines who were watching. "You know what?" he said, his voice shaking slightly with barely controlled rage. "That's it. You just assaulted me multiple times. You grabbed my hand. You refused to comply with a direct order. That's multiple violations. You're done." He pulled out his radio from his belt, his hands trembling as he keyed the microphone. But outside the dining facility, a phone call was already being made that would end Brett Callahan's career as he knew it. Brennan burst through the double doors of the dining facility into the bright afternoon sunlight. The autumn air was cool against his face, but his hands were already shaking as he fumbled for his cell phone. His fingers slipped as he unlocked the screen. He had to make 3 attempts before he got the number right. The battalion headquarters staff duty line rang twice before a sergeant answered with the crisp professionalism of someone trained to respond to emergencies. "Battalion staff duty, Sergeant Pierce speaking. How can I help you?" "Sergeant, this is Lance Corporal Brennan, Charlie Company," he said, speaking quickly, his words tumbling over each other. "You need to get the command sergeant major down to the dining facility immediately. Right now. No delay." "Whoa, slow down, Brennan," Pierce's voice came back, suddenly alert. "What's going on? Is there a fire? A medical emergency?" "It's not a medical emergency, Sergeant," Brennan said, pacing in tight circles on the concrete outside the facility, his free hand gesturing even though there was no one there to see it. "But it's bad. Staff Sergeant Callahan from Charlie Company is currently physically restraining a woman in the Chow line. He's been aggressive. He's been threatening her. He's called for military police intervention. And Sergeant," Brennan paused, taking a breath, "I'm pretty sure the woman he's harassing is General Margaret Thornton." There was a long silence on the other end of the line, the kind of silence where you can hear the hum of the electronics, the distant sounds of the base continuing on, oblivious to the bomb that had just been dropped. "Say again, Lance Corporal," Pierce said carefully. "General Thornton." "General Margaret Thornton," Brennan repeated, pressing his phone tighter against his ear. "The new deputy commanding general. I'm looking through the window right now, and she's standing at parade rest in the Chow line. She's wearing civilian clothes, a gray pullover and khaki pants, but I'm 99% sure it's her. I saw her picture in the orientation brief. The memorial bracelet on her wrist is an exact match. Sergeant, you need to get people here now." Another pause, longer this time. "I'm going to verify this, Brennan," Pierce said, his voice now tight with controlled urgency. "If you're wrong about this, if you're making accusations against a senior NCO based on a case of mistaken identity, there will be serious consequences for you." "I understand, Sergeant," Brennan said. But I'm looking at her right now. She hasn't moved. She's standing perfectly still while Callahan is basically having a meltdown. And if I'm right, this is about to become a very big problem for everyone involved. The sound of a chair scraping violently against the floor came through the phone, followed by the rattling of papers and the sound of rapid typing. "Hold on," Pierce said. "I'm pulling up the general's schedule. Just a minute. Okay, Oh my God." Brennan's heart was pounding. "According to this," Pierce continued, his voice strained, "General Thornton was conducting a personal physical fitness assessment this morning on the perimeter trail. There's a notation here that she was planning to grab lunch at the main dining facility afterward. That would have been approximately 12:45 hours. It's now 12:58. "So it's her," Brennan said, relief flooding through him. "I'm not crazy. It's definitely her." "Stand by," Pierce said, his professional composure cracking slightly. "I'm alerting the commanding officer and the command sergeant major immediately. I'm not even going to finish that sentence. Just stay on the line and keep your eyes on the situation. Do not interfere. Do not approach. Just observe and report." "Copy that, Sergeant," Brennan said. He held the phone to his ear and turned back to look through the glass doors of the dining facility. Inside, Callahan was still at the serving line, his face purple with rage, his radio in hand. The woman in the gray pullover was still perfectly motionless, waiting. And somewhere in the bowels of the base, multiple officers were receiving the message that everything was about to change. Inside the dining facility, the final confrontation was reaching its breaking point. Back inside the dining facility, the situation was reaching a critical threshold. Staff Sergeant Brett Callahan had his radio in hand, his thumb hovering over the transmit button. He was about to call this in officially, about to make it a matter of record, about to escalate this from a simple confrontation in the Chow line to an actual incident requiring military police response. He was about to make his move toward the end game, confident that once the MPs arrived, they would side with him. They would see a disruptive civilian and a Marine sergeant trying to maintain order, and the choice would be clear. But before his thumb could press that button, something happened. Something subtle but unmistakable. The air in the dining facility seemed to shift. It was as if the very atmosphere had changed, not visibly, not in any way that could be measured with instruments, but in a way that every Marine in the room felt in the pit of their stomach. The woman's posture changed. It was minute. Her shoulders drew back just slightly. Her spine straightened an additional inch. Her head tilted up and her eyes, those steady ice blue eyes, locked directly onto Callahan with an intensity that had previously been concealed beneath layers of restraint. More significantly, her voice changed. "I suggest you reconsider that action, Sergeant," she said quietly. But this time, the word quietly didn't mean what it had meant before. This quiet wasn't soft or submissive. This quiet was the kind of quiet that comes from someone who doesn't need to raise their voice because they know they will be obeyed. It was the quiet of absolute authority. It was the quiet of someone accustomed to giving orders in situations where people's lives depended on instant compliance. Several Marines in the dining facility visibly shuddered. Private First Class Antonio Ramirez actually set down his fork and sat back in his chair, his eyes widening. Torres and Fisher, who had been watching the entire situation unfold, exchanged a glance that communicated a single thought. Something fundamental had just shifted. Callahan felt it too, though he couldn't articulate what it was. All he knew was that something in her bearing had changed, and that change had triggered something primal in his brain. The part of the brain that recognizes genuine threat regardless of the outward appearance of the person delivering it. "You are making a scene," she continued, her voice dropping even lower in volume but somehow becoming even more penetrating. "You are violating the very discipline that you claim to represent. You are demonstrating a fundamental lack of understanding regarding your actual position in this chain of command. And you are doing all of this in front of your subordinates, which means they are now learning from you that respect comes from physical aggression rather than earned authority. Callahan's hand wavered. His thumb actually moved away from the transmit button just slightly, without his conscious decision to do so. His body was responding to something his conscious mind hadn't yet processed. "What are you?" he started, but she cut him off with a single raised hand. Not a violent gesture, just a slight elevation of her palm, the kind of gesture that a person makes when they're asking for silence in a meeting, but the authority in it was staggering. "Do not speak," she said. "You have demonstrated a pattern of behavior that suggests you do not understand the fundamental principles of Marine Corps leadership. You have confused domination with command. You have mistaken intimidation for respect. You have used your rank as a weapon against someone you perceive to be beneath you in status. And now you are about to make a decision that will have far-reaching consequences for your career and your future in this institution." Callahan's face was still purple with rage, but now confusion had joined the other emotions swirling there. His jaw worked silently, as if he wanted to say something but couldn't figure out what. His hands were trembling, but not with the trembling of someone about to take action. This was the trembling of someone whose foundations were beginning to shift beneath their feet. The entire dining facility was completely silent now, not the ordinary quiet of a pause in conversation, but the profound silence that comes when a large group of people all hold their breath simultaneously. Every eye was fixed on the confrontation. Every ear was straining to hear every word. This was the moment where the narrative was flipping, where the expected outcome was being challenged, where something unexpected was about to happen. "You told me," she continued, her voice taking on a quality that suggested she was explaining something to a child who was struggling to understand a basic concept, "that this dining facility was for warriors. You used that word as a club. You threw it in my face as an insult, as a way of establishing that you and your Marines are somehow different from, somehow superior to, someone you perceived as a civilian." She stepped forward slightly, not aggressively, just a single step that brought her closer to Callahan, who had unconsciously taken a half-step backward in response. "But that word, warrior, is not something you get to claim casually. That word carries weight. That word means something." She paused, letting that statement hang in the air. "A warrior," she said, "is not someone who uses their rank to bully people who are smaller or who they perceive to be weaker. A warrior is not someone who confuses strength with cruelty. A warrior is someone who understands that their rank comes with responsibility, that their authority comes with the obligation to set an example, that their stripes are not trophies to be displayed but burdens to be carried." Callahan's radio was still in his hand, but his grip on it had loosened. His eyes were fixed on her face, trying to process something that his mind was struggling to compute. "Furthermore, Sergeant," she said, her voice taking on an edge that made the hair on the back of several Marines' necks stand on end, "you have physically assaulted me multiple times. You grabbed my arm with enough force to leave marks. You attempted to physically remove me from a location where I have every right to be. You threatened me with legal consequences if I didn't comply with your unlawful orders. All of this has been witnessed by dozens of people." She gestured casually around the dining facility, as if she had only just become aware of the dozens of Marines all watching in stunned silence. "And now," she continued, "you are about to compound those violations by making a false report to law enforcement. You are about to claim that I assaulted you when in fact the reverse is true. You are about to lie to the military police in an attempt to cover up your own misconduct. Do you understand what I'm telling you, Sergeant?" Callahan's mouth opened and closed. No sound came out. "That," she said, would be filing a false report, obstruction of justice, abuse of your position. Those are serious offenses, Sergeant Callahan. Those are offenses that result in courts-martial. Those are offenses that end careers. She paused, letting that statement settle over the room like a blanket of cold water. So I am going to give you one opportunity to make a different choice, she said. You are going to lower that radio. You are going to step aside from this serving line. You are going to allow me to complete my lunch. And you are going to contemplate very seriously what it means to be a leader in the United States Marine Corps. Callahan's hand was shaking so badly now that the radio clattered against his leg. He tried to grip it tighter, but his fingers didn't seem to be responding properly to his brain's commands. If you choose not to comply with what I am asking, she continued, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper, then you will face consequences that will make anything that might happen to you in the next 5 minutes seem minor by comparison. Do you understand what I am saying? Slowly, very slowly, Callahan lowered the radio. He didn't turn it off. He didn't set it down. He just lowered it to his side, his arm hanging limply, his entire body seeming to deflate as if someone had let the air out of him. Behind him, the two lance corporals exchanged a glance that communicated a single thought. They had just witnessed something that they would never forget, something that had fundamentally altered their understanding of power and authority. And then, just as the situation seemed to be reaching its conclusion, the doors to the dining facility burst open. At battalion headquarters, approximately 2 miles from the dining facility, Sergeant Pierce had just finished his urgent conversation with Lance Corporal Brennan. His hands were shaking slightly as he set down the phone. For a long moment, he simply stared at his computer screen, at the schedule that clearly indicated that Brigadier General Margaret Thornton was indeed on the installation and had been conducting personal fitness activities on the perimeter trail. The implications of what he had just learned were staggering. Pierce didn't waste time second-guessing himself. In the military, when you received information this critical, you moved fast and let the verification process catch up to you. He stood up from his desk with such force that his chair rolled backward and crashed into the wall behind him. His supervisor, a captain, looked up from his own desk with alarm. Sir, we have a situation, Pierce said, his voice clipped and professional despite the adrenaline now flooding his system. I just received a report that Staff Sergeant Brett Callahan from Charlie Company is currently harassing, threatening, and possibly assaulting a female civilian at the main dining facility. The civilian in question is believed to be General Thornton. The captain's face went pale. General Thornton, the new deputy commanding general. Yes, sir, Pierce confirmed. Lance Corporal Brennan from Charlie Company called it in. He positively identified her based on the orientation briefing photo and her appearance. She was supposed to be at the facility around this time according to her schedule. The timeline matches up. Jesus Christ, the captain breathed, standing up immediately. Get me the commanding officer and the command sergeant major on the phone right now, and alert Colonel Harrison. He needs to know about this immediately. Pierce was already moving toward the phone, his fingers flying across the buttons as he began making calls. The first priority was the battalion commanding officer, a lieutenant colonel named Marcus Shelby. The second was Command Sergeant Major Garrett Monroe, the senior enlisted advisor for the entire battalion. The third was the installation's deputy commander, Colonel Harrison, who would need to be informed immediately. The calls took less than 3 minutes to make. By the time Pierce finished, a chain reaction had been set in motion that would cascade through the entire installation's command structure like dominoes falling in slow motion. At his office across the base, Lieutenant Colonel Shelby was attending a meeting with the installation's engineering officer when his aide burst through the door without knocking. The aide was a young private, visibly flustered, and the breach of protocol immediately told Shelby that something serious was happening. "Sir, you need to take a call from battalion right now," the aide said. "It's marked priority." Shelby excused himself from the meeting and took the call in his office. As Pierce relayed the information, Shelby's expression shifted from curiosity to concern to something approaching panic. He listened without interrupting, understanding that Pierce wouldn't be calling with this level of urgency without solid information backing it up. "Confirm the general's location one more time," Shelby ordered. "And get Command Sergeant Major Monroe to the dining facility immediately. I'm heading there now. Notify the military police not to respond to any calls from the dining facility until we've assessed the situation. And Pierce, keep your phone on. I want updates as they happen." Command Sergeant Major Garrett Monroe received the call in his office at nearly the same moment. Monroe was a man who had served 28 years in the Marine Corps. He had seen combat in 3 different countries, had been wounded twice, and had attained his position through a combination of military competence and the kind of no-nonsense attitude that junior Marines both feared and respected. He listened to the information being relayed to him with the same calm professionalism he brought to every crisis. But internally, he was running through the implications with the speed of a tactical computer. This was bad. This was very, very bad. And it was about to get exponentially worse for Staff Sergeant Callahan. "I'm en route," Monroe said simply. "Alert the officer of the day. Get him to the dining facility as well. And Pierce, if those military police show up before I do, you call me immediately and I'll divert them. We need to contain this before it becomes an even bigger mess than it already is." Monroe hung up the phone and was already moving toward the door, his campaign cover in one hand and his duty belt in the other. He didn't bother with an explanation of what he was doing or where he was going. In the military, when the command sergeant major starts moving with that level of urgency, people get out of the way and ask questions later. Lieutenant Colonel Shelby was the first to arrive at the dining facility, pulling up to the main entrance in his staff car at near sprint pace. He moved through the doors with the kind of decisive action that comes from a man accustomed to command. Behind him came the officer of the day, a captain named Robert Summers, who had heard the abbreviated version of the situation and was preparing himself for whatever he was about to encounter. What they found was a dining facility that had gone completely silent. Every Marine present seemed to be holding their breath. At the serving line, a woman in a gray pullover stood with perfect posture, while Staff Sergeant Callahan looked like a man who had just experienced something that had shattered his entire understanding of the world. "What is happening here?" Shelby demanded, his voice cutting through the silence like a knife. For a moment, no one answered. Then Callahan attempted to stand at attention, his movements jerky and uncoordinated, his eyes wide. "Sir, I was just—" Command Sergeant Major Monroe arrived before Callahan could finish his sentence. Monroe appeared in the doorway like an avenging angel, his expression set in a grimace that suggested he had just arrived at the scene of a disaster. Behind him came 2 additional officers, a major and a staff sergeant, who Monroe had apparently grabbed on his way through the base. The entire room came to absolute attention. Every Marine who was standing snapped to rigid attention. Every Marine who was sitting carefully set down their utensils and came to the position of attention while remaining seated. It was an automatic response to the presence of this much leadership suddenly materializing at once. Monroe moved directly toward Callahan, his eyes blazing with controlled fury. "Step away from the serving line," Monroe commanded. "Now!" Callahan moved with the desperate speed of a man who had suddenly realized he was in genuine trouble. He shuffled to the side, his eyes darting between the various officers who had suddenly filled the dining facility. Lieutenant Colonel Shelby approached the woman in the gray pullover with measured steps. For a moment, he simply looked at her, confirming with his own eyes what he had already been told. Her auburn hair, her bearing, the memorial bracelet on her wrist, the calm, composed expression that suggested she had just been waiting for someone to arrive and take control of the situation. "General Thornton," Shelby said, his voice suddenly shifting from command tone to the respectful address due to a superior officer. "We sincerely apologize for what has occurred here today. This situation is completely unacceptable." The woman nodded slightly, acknowledging his words with a grace that seemed to fill the entire room. "Colonel," she said simply, "perhaps we should step into your office so that we might discuss this matter in a more private setting. But before we do, I believe your Sergeant Major has some matters to address with Staff Sergeant Callahan." Command Sergeant Major Monroe, overhearing this, turned to face Callahan with the focused intensity of a predator who had just spotted its prey. "Staff Sergeant Callahan," Monroe said, his voice dropping to a low tone that somehow seemed louder than if he had shouted, "you are to consider yourself relieved of your duties effective immediately. You will report to my office at 900 hours tomorrow morning. You will prepare a written statement detailing everything that transpired here today, and you will understand that your career in the United States Marine Corps is currently balanced on the edge of a knife." Callahan was pale now, his entire body trembling with the reality of what was happening. The reckoning had only just begun. The commanding presence of Lieutenant Colonel Shelby, Command Sergeant Major Monroe, and the additional officers who had materialized in the dining facility seemed to shift the very gravity in the room. Every junior Marine present understood on an instinctive level that they were witnessing the arrival of the institution's authority in its most concentrated form. This wasn't just a few senior people showing up to investigate a complaint. This was the command structure itself materializing to address a situation of profound significance. Shelby gestured toward the woman in the gray pullover with a respect that communicated volumes to everyone watching. "General Thornton, if you would please follow me to my office. I believe we can address this situation more appropriately away from the dining facility." As Shelby spoke those words, he also made a subtle gesture toward Command Sergeant Major Monroe, the kind of wordless communication that comes from years of working together, of understanding each other's priorities and responsibilities. Monroe immediately understood. Shelby would handle the general, gather the details, and protect her from further disruption. Monroe's job was to deal with the immediate situation and the junior Marines who were now witnessing the consequences of allowing a senior NCO to abuse his position. General Thornton, for there was no longer any doubt in anyone's mind about who she was, simply nodded and began moving toward the exit with Shelby. As she passed by the tables where Marines were still standing at attention, she maintained her perfect composure, her bearing unchanged, her expression calm and professional. There was no triumph in her expression. There was no satisfaction at having been proven right. There was only the quiet dignity of someone accustomed to carrying the weight of command. It was this dignity more than anything else that made the impact of the moment so devastating to Staff Sergeant Callahan. Callahan had been expecting any number of possible outcomes. He had expected anger. He had expected confrontation. He had expected shouting and accusations. What he had not expected was this: absolute, unflinching professional response. What he had not expected was to witness a general officer being escorted away from a dining facility with the kind of respectful courtesy usually reserved for state dinners or official ceremonies. The moment General Thornton departed the dining facility, the entire atmosphere in the room shifted again. The tension that had been building throughout the confrontation suddenly found an outlet. Marines began to move, to shift in their chairs, to release the breath they had been holding. Conversations started in hushed tones, spreading like wildfire through the facility as junior Marines began to comprehend what they had just witnessed. Command Sergeant Major Monroe stood in the center of the serving line, his broad frame filling the space where moments before the confrontation had taken place. His eyes swept across the room, taking in the Marines watching him, gauging their reactions. When his gaze settled on Staff Sergeant Callahan, the temperature in that immediate vicinity seemed to drop 20 degrees. "Staff Sergeant Callahan," Monroe said, his voice carrying the weight of 28 years of military experience and absolute command authority, "you will remain where you are. Do not move, do not speak, do not even breathe in a way I find objectionable. Is that understood?" "Yes, Sergeant Major," Callahan whispered, his voice barely audible. Monroe turned to the two lance corporals who had been flanking Callahan throughout the confrontation. These two young men were now visibly terrified, understanding that they had been complicit in the situation, even if only by their presence and their early laughter. "You too," Monroe said, pointing at them. "I want your names, your units, and your chain of command. You will each prepare a written statement detailing exactly what you observed during this incident. Those statements will be delivered to your company commanders by 1600 hours today. Furthermore, you will each report to my office at 800 hours tomorrow morning to give me a verbal account. Do not miss that meeting. Do not be late. Do you understand?" "Yes, Sergeant Major," both lance corporals replied in unison, their voices shaking. Monroe then addressed the entire dining facility, his gaze sweeping across every Marine present with the systematic precision of someone conducting a formal inventory. "All of you," he said, his voice ringing out clearly across the room, "are now witnesses to a significant incident. What you observed here today is conduct unbecoming of a Marine. What you observed is the abuse of rank and authority. What you observed is exactly what we do not stand for in this institution." He paused, letting that statement settle over the room. "Each of you will be contacted by the investigating officer within the next 48 hours to provide a statement regarding what you witnessed." He took a step closer to Callahan, his eyes never leaving the sergeant's face. "But more importantly," he continued, "I want every single one of you to understand something. The woman who just left this dining facility is Brigadier General Margaret Thornton, the newly appointed Deputy Commanding General of this installation. She came here in her personal time, attempting to conduct a simple action, getting lunch in a facility that explicitly allows all hands to be present. Instead of being treated with the respect due to her rank and her position, she was subjected to harassment, physical contact, and threats by a non-commissioned officer who somehow believed that his stripes gave him the right to abuse that authority." Monroe took a step closer to Callahan, his eyes never leaving the sergeant's face. "This," Monroe said, gesturing at Callahan with obvious contempt, "is what happens when leadership forgets what it means to be a leader. This is what we get when someone confuses rank with power. This is what occurs when a Marine loses sight of the core values that bind this institution together. And I will personally guarantee you that this situation will serve as an example for this entire battalion about what not to do." The major and staff sergeant who had accompanied Monroe moved to stand on either side of Callahan, creating a visual statement about his isolation and vulnerability. He was surrounded now, not by his peers or his subordinates, but by senior leadership who viewed him as a problem that needed to be managed. Monroe walked over to the serving line and looked at the food that had been abandoned during the confrontation. He picked up a plastic tray and extended it toward one of the junior Marines standing nearby. "Private," Monroe said to a young private first class named Blake Anderson, "come here and get yourself some lunch." General Thornton was trying to eat before she was so rudely interrupted. "The rest of you will proceed in an orderly fashion through this line. You will eat your lunch. You will conduct yourselves with the professionalism expected of United States Marines, and you will reflect on what you've witnessed here today." Over the next 72 hours, the investigation that followed was methodical and comprehensive. Statements were collected from 47 Marines who had been present in the dining facility at the time of the incident. Photographs were documented. The serving line was measured and mapped. Audio recordings of witness testimonies were transcribed and filed. By the time Command Sergeant Major Monroe convened the formal disciplinary hearing on Friday morning, a complete portrait of Staff Sergeant Brett Callahan's conduct had been established beyond any reasonable doubt. The hearing took place in a small conference room adjacent to battalion headquarters. Present were Lieutenant Colonel Shelby, Command Sergeant Major Monroe, the battalion's legal officer, a senior officer from the installation's command staff, and Staff Sergeant Callahan himself. Notably absent was General Thornton, who had chosen not to attend, leaving the matter in the hands of the institutional processes designed to address such situations. Shelby sat at the head of the table, his expression grave and composed. Monroe sat to his right, his massive frame seeming to fill that entire section of the room. Callahan sat across from them, flanked by a staff judge advocate who had been appointed to represent him. The legal officer read the charges: assault on a federal officer, abuse of rank and authority, conduct unbecoming of a Marine, filing a false report, obstruction of justice, and violation of the core values of the Marine Corps. Each charge was documented with specific evidence. Each charge was supported by witness testimony. Each charge carried the weight of institutional authority and military law. Callahan's legal representative attempted to mount a defense, suggesting that there had been miscommunication, that Callahan had been operating under the mistaken belief that the woman was a civilian who did not have authorization to be in the facility, that his actions had been defensive rather than aggressive. It was a thin argument, and everyone in the room knew it. The evidence was simply too overwhelming. When the opportunity came for Callahan to speak on his own behalf, he sat in silence for nearly a minute, his jaw working silently, his hands trembling in his lap. Finally, he looked up at Lieutenant Colonel Shelby. "Sir," Callahan said, his voice barely a whisper, I don't have anything to say. What I did was wrong. I know it was wrong. I knew it was wrong when I was doing it, and I did it anyway because I thought I had the authority to do it. I thought my rank gave me the right to treat people however I wanted to treat them. It was an admission that was almost worse than if he had continued to fight the charges. It was an acknowledgement that he had known exactly what he was doing and had chosen to do it anyway. Shelby and Monroe exchanged a glance. There was no satisfaction in that glance, no triumph. There was only the somber understanding of men who were witnessing the destruction of a career that might have been salvageable if different choices had been made. "Staff Sergeant Callahan," Shelby said, his voice carrying the formal tone of an officer conducting official business. "Based on the evidence presented, the witness testimony, and your own acknowledgement of the charges, I have concluded that you are guilty of all counts. However, before I impose sentence, General Thornton has requested the opportunity to address you directly. That request has been granted." The conference room door opened, and General Margaret Thornton entered in full dress uniform. Her forest green service dress uniform was immaculate, adorned with the medals and ribbons that testified to 20 years of military service. On her collar, the stars of a brigadier general gleamed under the fluorescent lights. Her bearing was perfect, her expression composed but not cold. This was not a woman filled with rage or vindictiveness. This was a woman executing a duty that fell to her as a senior leader in the institution. Callahan stood immediately, coming to attention with such jerky, desperate movements that he nearly knocked over his chair. His face had gone completely white. "At ease, Sergeant," General Thornton said, her voice carrying the same calm authority it had carried in the dining facility 3 days prior. "Please sit down." Callahan sat, his hands now gripping the edge of the table so tightly that his knuckles had turned white. What General Thornton said next would determine not just Callahan's fate, but the kind of leader he might become. General Thornton positioned herself so that she could see Callahan clearly, though she also maintained visual contact with Shelby and Monroe. When she spoke, her words were measured and deliberate, each one chosen with precision. "Staff Sergeant Callahan," she began, "I want you to understand something. I am not here to humiliate you further. I am not here to add to your shame or to amplify your fall. I am here because it is my responsibility as a senior officer in this institution to ensure that the lessons of this incident are learned, not just by you, but by everyone in this battalion who will hear about what occurred." She paused, letting that statement settle. "3 days ago," she continued, "you made a series of choices. You chose to judge me based on my appearance. You chose to assume that because I was wearing civilian clothes and did not display rank insignia, I did not deserve respect. You chose to use your position and your physical size to intimidate someone you believed to be beneath you. And most significantly, you chose to do all of this in front of your subordinates, which meant that your choices were not just about me. They were about the example you were setting for those junior Marines." Callahan's eyes were now filled with tears, though he was clearly trying to hold them back through sheer force of will. "I have reviewed your personnel file," General Thornton said. "You have 8 years of service. You have 2 deployment cycles. You have been recommended for promotion multiple times. By all accounts, you were on a trajectory to become a competent senior leader in this institution. And then, in a span of less than an hour, you destroyed that trajectory through your own choices." She stepped closer to him, not in a threatening way, but in the manner of a senior leader addressing a subordinate who needed to hear difficult truths. "But I want you to understand why I requested to address you directly," she continued. "It is not because I want you to suffer. It is because I want you to understand what you did wrong and why it matters. You told me that the mess hall was for warriors. You used that word as a weapon. You used it as a way to establish dominance. And in doing so, you demonstrated a fundamental misunderstanding of what that word means." She moved to the window, looking out across the base, her hands clasped behind her back. 20 years ago," she said, her voice taking on a different quality now, more personal, less official. "I was a young captain deployed to a remote fire base in a country that was not at peace. I was responsible for over 150 Marines. We operated in an environment where every decision could result in casualties. We operated under conditions that most people cannot even imagine. And during that time, I worked with Marines who understood what it meant to be a warrior." She turned back to face Callahan, and her eyes held something that made every person in the room lean forward slightly, sensing that they were about to hear something significant. "A warrior," she said, "is not someone who uses their strength against those they perceive to be weaker. A warrior is someone who uses their strength to protect those who are vulnerable. A warrior is someone who understands that their position and their rank come with the responsibility to set an example, to lead by character rather than by fear, to inspire rather than to intimidate." She moved back to the table, positioning herself directly across from Callahan. "I have seen Marines who understood this," she continued. "Marines who led through respect rather than through aggression. Marines who understood that the rank on their collar was not a symbol of their personal power, but rather a symbol of their responsibility to those under their command. And I have also seen Marines who confused strength with cruelty, who mistook intimidation for leadership, who used their authority as a weapon against their own people." Her gaze intensified, locking directly onto Callahan's eyes. "You were beginning to become one of those Marines," she said. "And if you had continued on that trajectory, you would have damaged not just your own career, but the cohesion and effectiveness of every unit you commanded. You would have created an environment of fear rather than respect." and you would have failed in the fundamental duty of a Marine leader, which is to develop your subordinates into better Marines than they were when you first took charge of them. She paused, and in that pause the weight of her words seemed to settle over the entire room like a physical force. "The question now," she said, "is what you do with this moment. Do you learn from it? Do you understand the fundamental lesson that your rank is not about you, it is about your responsibility to those under your command? Or do you allow bitterness and resentment to define your future?" General Thornton's words hung in the air of the conference room, and for a long moment no one spoke. The silence was profound, the kind of silence that comes when people understand they have just witnessed something significant. Staff Sergeant Callahan sat with his head bowed, his shoulders shaking slightly, tears now streaming openly down his face. These were not the tears of someone angry at being caught or resentful at the consequences. These were the tears of someone who had genuinely confronted himself and was not liking what he saw. Lieutenant Colonel Shelby allowed the silence to continue for another 30 seconds, respecting the gravity of the moment. Then he cleared his throat and began to speak, his voice carrying the formal authority of a commanding officer imposing sentence. "Staff Sergeant Callahan," Shelby said, "based on all evidence presented, all witness testimony, and your admission of guilt, I am imposing the following consequences." The sentence that followed would change the trajectory of Callahan's entire military career. "First," Shelby continued, "you are being reduced in rank from staff sergeant to sergeant, effective immediately. This reduction will result in a corresponding reduction in pay and benefits." Callahan's head came up slightly, his eyes widening at the formal pronouncement. "Second," Shelby said, "you are being removed from your current billet and reassigned to the dining facility maintenance and food service operations, effective immediately. You will report to the dining facility senior enlisted advisor at 600 hours tomorrow morning." Callahan's eyes widened further. The dining facility, the place where he had committed his offense, was now going to be his workplace. A constant reminder of his failure. "Third," Shelby continued, "you are being placed on a 6-month probation period. During this time, your conduct will be monitored closely. Any further infractions, no matter how minor, will result in your immediate discharge from the Marine Corps. You will participate in mandatory leadership training, including remedial courses on the core values of the Marine Corps, ethical leadership practices, and interpersonal communication. These courses will be completed within the next 90 days. Shelby paused, letting the weight of these consequences settle on Callahan. "Fourth," Shelby said, "you will participate in a structured mentorship program under the direct supervision of Command Sergeant Major Monroe. This program is designed to help you understand the difference between authority and power, between rank and character. You will meet with Sergeant Major Monroe every Friday at 1400 hours for 1-hour sessions. These sessions are mandatory. Missing even one will result in additional consequences up to and including discharge." General Thornton nodded slightly, acknowledging this decision. It was clear that she had approved the course of action beforehand. "Finally," Shelby said, his voice becoming slightly softer, "understand that these consequences are not designed to destroy you. They are designed to rehabilitate you. You have violated the trust that was placed in you when you were promoted to the rank of staff sergeant. You have failed to live up to the standard that your rank requires. But you are not the first Marine to make this mistake, and you will not be the last. What matters now is how you respond to this correction." Shelby stood, indicating that the formal portion of the hearing was concluded. Monroe and the other officers also stood. Only General Thornton remained seated for a moment longer, her eyes still fixed on Callahan. "Sergeant Callahan," she said quietly, using his new rank rather than his old one, "look at me." Callahan forced himself to meet her gaze, though the shame was radiating off him in waves. "I want you to understand something," she said. "In my career, I have seen many Marines fail. I have seen many make mistakes. But I have also seen many of those same Marines recover from those mistakes and go on to become excellent leaders. The question is, which category are you going to fall into? That decision is entirely up to you. She stood, and when she did, something shifted in her expression. There was no longer anger there. There was no longer condescension. There was only the respect that one professional shows to another professional who is attempting to rise to a challenge. "You have my confidence that you will make the right choice," she said simply. Then she left the conference room, her uniform immaculate, her bearing perfect, leaving behind a silence so profound that it seemed to echo off the walls. Over the next 72 hours, the entire battalion heard about the consequences imposed on Sergeant Callahan. The story spread through the ranks like wildfire. Word of his reduction in rank, his reassignment to the dining facility, his mandatory mentorship with the command sergeant major, his probation status, all of it became common knowledge. What also became clear, however, was that this was not a destruction of a Marine, but rather a correction of a Marine who had lost his way. By Monday morning, Sergeant Callahan reported to the dining facility at 600 hours as ordered. He was wearing his new rank, the chevrons that marked him as a sergeant rather than a staff sergeant. The senior enlisted advisor for the dining facility, a grizzled gunnery sergeant named Vincent Monroe, no relation to the command sergeant major, who had seen everything the Marine Corps had to offer, greeted him with a level of professionalism that suggested neither judgment nor pity, simply acceptance of the situation. "Welcome to the scullery, Sergeant," Gunnery Sergeant Monroe said, his voice matter-of-fact. "You're going to start by learning how this operation actually works, not just from the perspective of someone who eats here, but from the perspective of the people who make it run. We'll start with the dishwashing station. That's where everything flows through. That's where you're going to get a real understanding of what it takes to maintain these facilities." For the first week, that was exactly what Callahan did. He scrubbed pots and pans. He washed serving trays. He mopped floors. He cleaned the massive industrial ovens that had to be maintained to the highest standards. His hands, which had been soft and relatively unblemished, developed calluses and small cuts from the harsh industrial cleansers and the rough surfaces of the pots. His back, which was used to the relatively light duty of a staff sergeant, ached from the physical labor of the dining facility. But something else happened as well. As he worked, Callahan began to observe. He began to understand the complexity of the operation that he had taken for granted. He began to see the skill and dedication required to feed hundreds of Marines each day. He began to talk to the Marines who worked in the facility, junior enlisted personnel, specialists, junior NCOs, and he began to hear their perspective on what leadership actually meant to them. The first Friday after his reassignment, Callahan reported to Command Sergeant Major Monroe's office for his mandatory mentorship session. Monroe was sitting behind his desk, his massive frame seeming to fill the entire office. He gestured for Callahan to sit in the chair across from him. "How's the scullery?" Monroe asked without preamble. "It's humbling, Sergeant Major," Callahan replied honestly. "I had no idea how much work goes into maintaining that facility. I had no idea what those junior Marines go through every single day just to make sure that everyone else gets fed." Monroe nodded, satisfied with this response. "That was the entire point, Sergeant. You needed to understand that your rank doesn't make you superior to those people. Your rank means you have a responsibility to those people. You have a responsibility to make sure they're trained properly, that they're taken care of, that they understand that their work matters. When you forget that, when you start treating rank like it's a personal possession rather than a responsibility, that's when you become the kind of leader that nobody wants to follow." Monroe pulled out a notebook and opened it to the first page. "Here's what we're going to do," Monroe said. "Every Friday for the next 6 months, we're going to work through this leadership curriculum together. We're going to talk about what it means to be a Marine. We're going to talk about core values. We're going to discuss specific situations and how different approaches would have yielded different outcomes. By the end of this process, I want you to understand, not just intellectually, but emotionally in your bones, what it means to lead with character rather than with authority. Callahan nodded, understanding that this was not going to be an easy process, but also understanding that it was necessary. "One more thing," Monroe said, his expression becoming slightly less stern. "General Thornton requested that I tell you something. She said to tell you that she doesn't do this for everyone. She doesn't invest time and effort in redemption for Marines who she doesn't think have the potential to become excellent leaders. The fact that she's invested this time in you, that she's willing to work with me on your development, that means she believes you can come back from this. Don't waste that belief." 3 months would pass before Callahan truly understood what Monroe meant. 3 months into his assignment at the dining facility, Sergeant Brett Callahan had become a different person. Not entirely different, the core of who he was remained, but fundamentally altered in the way he understood his place in the world and his responsibility to those around him. The calluses on his hands had stopped expanding, but they had deepened, becoming hard and permanent reminders of the work he had done and continued to do each day. His uniform, while still meticulously maintained, now bore the weight of genuine humility rather than arrogant pride. The Friday mentorship sessions with Command Sergeant Major Monroe had become the anchor point of Callahan's week. Over those 12 weeks, Monroe had guided him through the leadership curriculum with the precision of a surgeon and the patience of a teacher who understood that real change takes time. They had discussed the core values of the Marine Corps: honor, courage, and commitment. And Monroe had forced Callahan to confront every instance in which he had violated those values through his actions in the dining facility. More importantly, Monroe had begun to see genuine change in the Marine sitting across from him each week. "Tell me about last week," Monroe said during their 13th session, opening his notebook to the page where he tracked Callahan's progress. "Gunnery Sergeant Monroe assigned me to train 3 new junior Marines on the proper sanitization protocols for the serving line," Callahan said, his voice carrying a tone of genuine accomplishment mixed with continued humility. "I spent 3 hours with them, walking through every step, explaining not just what to do, but why we do it. At the end of the session, one of them, Private Ramirez, asked me why I cared so much about getting the details right. And instead of giving him some canned answer about regulations, I actually told him the truth." Monroe leaned back in his chair, waiting for Callahan to continue. "I told him," Callahan said, "that every Marine who eats food from this facility deserves to know that someone cared enough about their well-being to do the job right. I told him that his work mattered, not because it was on some official record, but because it directly affected the health and morale of hundreds of people. And Sergeant Major, I meant it. I actually felt it when I said it." Monroe nodded, making a note in his notebook. "And how did Private Ramirez respond?" "He asked if he could get assigned to my training rotation permanently," Callahan said, a slight smile crossing his face. "He said that most sergeants just yell at you until you do it right, but I actually helped him understand why it matters. I've never had a junior Marine ask for that before." "That," Monroe said, setting down his pen, "is the difference between a leader and a bully. A bully creates compliance through fear. A leader creates commitment through understanding and respect. You're starting to understand that difference." The conversation shifted, as it always did, toward the bigger picture of Callahan's future. Monroe pulled out a different notebook from his drawer, this one documenting Callahan's official progress and recommendations. "Your probation status ends in 3 months, Monroe said. "At that point, we'll conduct a formal review of your conduct, your performance in the dining facility assignment, and your overall progress through the leadership development program. Based on what I'm seeing, I anticipate that the review will be positive. However, that doesn't mean you automatically get promoted back to staff sergeant. What it means is that you'll have the opportunity to compete for advancement through the standard competitive process, like every other Marine. Callahan nodded, understanding the implications. He had been given a second chance, but he would have to earn his way back up just like everyone else. "There's something else I want to discuss with you," Monroe said, his expression becoming slightly less stern. "General Thornton has asked me to invite you to a small gathering she's hosting at her quarters next Thursday evening. It's not a formal military function. It's a casual dinner with a few junior Marines that she's been mentoring. She wants you to be there." Callahan's eyes widened. "General Thornton wants me to come to her quarters, after what I did." "After what you did and how you've responded to the consequences," Monroe corrected. "The general doesn't typically invest her personal time in people who don't show genuine potential for growth. The fact that she's continuing to invest in your development by having you participate in this gathering means she's taking a personal interest in your redemption. Don't waste that." What happened at that dinner would prove to be a turning point in Callahan's understanding of true leadership. Thursday evening came, and Callahan found himself standing outside General Thornton's quarters on the officers' side of the base, wearing his dress uniform and feeling more nervous than he had been during the initial confrontation in the dining facility. That moment had been about physical courage and standing your ground. This moment was about something more difficult. It was about facing the person he had wronged and accepting the reality of his own transformation. General Thornton answered the door personally, still in her uniform though without her jacket, suggesting she had been working late and had only recently changed for the casual gathering. When she saw Callahan, a genuine smile crossed her face. "Sergeant Callahan," she said, extending her hand. "Thank you for coming. Please come in." The interior of her quarters was warm and welcoming, decorated with photographs from her various deployments and service. Several junior Marines were already there, a mix of lance corporals and sergeants who were clearly being mentored by General Thornton as part of what appeared to be an informal but structured program for developing future leaders. "Everyone," General Thornton said, gesturing to the small gathering, "I want to introduce you to Sergeant Callahan. Some of you may have heard about the incident in the dining facility 3 months ago. Sergeant Callahan is here tonight because he's a Marine who made a serious mistake, confronted that mistake, and is committed to becoming a better leader as a result. I believe that's a story worth knowing." The evening progressed with casual conversation, with Callahan gradually becoming more comfortable as he interacted with the other Marines. What struck him most was that General Thornton treated all of them the same way, with respect, with genuine interest in their development, with a willingness to share her own experiences and insights. She wasn't looking for deference. She was looking for engagement and growth. Near the end of the evening, General Thornton pulled Callahan aside into a quieter section of her quarters. "How are you doing?" she asked, her voice shifting to something more personal than the professional tone she used with the larger group. "I'm doing well, General," Callahan replied. "I want to thank you for the opportunity to be here, and more than that, I want to apologize again for what happened in the dining facility. There's no excuse for how I treated you." "You're right," General Thornton said without hesitation. "There is no excuse, but what matters is not the mistake you made. What matters is how you've responded to the consequences, and from what Sergeant Major Monroe has reported, you've responded the right way." She gestured toward the window where the lights of the base were visible in the distance. "Do you know why I personally invested time in your correction?" she asked. "No, ma'am," Callahan said honestly. "Because I saw potential," she said simply. "I saw a Marine who had confused rank with power, but who I believed could learn the difference. I've been in this institution for 20 years, Sergeant Callahan. I've seen many Marines who made mistakes like yours. The ones who survived and thrived were the ones who were willing to be humbled, who were willing to learn, who were willing to accept that their rank was about responsibility rather than personal power. She turned to face him directly. You have the potential to become an excellent leader, she said, but only if you remember this moment. Only if you remember how it felt to be humiliated, to face the consequences of your actions, and to have to rebuild your reputation from scratch. Leaders who remember their own failures tend to be leaders who are compassionate to the failures of others. That's the kind of leader I believe you can become. Callahan's eyes were filled with tears again, but these were different tears than before. These were tears of gratitude, of relief, of understanding that he had been given something precious. A second chance from someone who mattered, someone who believed in him. Thank you, General, he said, his voice steady. I won't waste this. I know you won't, she replied. That's why I'm investing in you. 6 months had passed since that fateful day in the dining facility when Staff Sergeant Brett Callahan had made the decision to shove a woman he didn't recognize. The installation had moved on to other matters, other crises, other dramas that demanded the attention of the command staff. But for Sergeant Callahan, those 6 months had represented the most significant period of personal growth and professional development of his 8 years in the Marine Corps. His probation period had ended the previous week. The formal review conducted by Lieutenant Colonel Shelby, Command Sergeant Major Monroe, and a board of senior officers had resulted in a clear verdict. Sergeant Callahan was no longer on probation. His conduct over the previous 6 months had been exemplary. His performance in the dining facility had been nothing short of transformative. His participation in the leadership development program had shown genuine commitment and understanding. Most significantly, the Marines under his nominal supervision, the junior enlisted who worked in the dining facility, had reported that he was a leader worth following. The reduction in rank from staff sergeant to sergeant was permanent, a consequence that would follow him throughout the remainder of his career as a visible reminder of his failure. However, he was now eligible to compete for promotion to staff sergeant once again through the standard competitive process, meaning that his mistake, while serious, was not career-ending. He had been given the opportunity to rebuild, and he had seized that opportunity with both hands. On Friday afternoon, Callahan reported to Command Sergeant Major Monroe's office for what would be their final, regularly scheduled mentorship session. The weekly Friday meetings had become such a fixture in his life that the thought of not having them felt strange, like losing a routine that had become comforting despite its challenging nature. Monroe was sitting behind his desk as usual, but this time there was something different about his expression. There was a satisfaction there, a sense of completion, as if he had seen a project through to a successful conclusion. Well, Sergeant, Monroe said, gesturing for Callahan to sit down, we've reached the end of our formal mentorship program. Your probation period has ended with flying colors. Your conduct has been exemplary. By all measures, you have successfully completed the corrective process that General Thornton and I set out for you. Callahan nodded, unsure of what to say. In some way, he felt like this moment should be more momentous, more celebratory. Instead, it felt quiet, understated, which somehow felt more authentic than any grand celebration could have been. However, Monroe continued, I want you to understand something. The end of this formal program doesn't mean the end of your development as a leader. What it means is that you're now responsible for your own continued growth. You don't have me mandating weekly sessions anymore. You don't have probation hanging over your head. You have freedom. And the question is, what are you going to do with that freedom? Monroe pulled out a small wooden box from his desk drawer. Inside the box, sitting on a bed of soft black velvet, was a coin. It was weathered, aged, obviously well worn. On one side it bore the emblem of the Marine Corps. On the other side was engraved a series of numbers and a name, a unit designation and a date that meant something to Monroe. "This," Monroe said, extending the box toward Callahan, "is a commander's coin. It's from a deployment I made 20 years ago. It's one of the few physical possessions from my career that I still keep close. I'm giving it to you for a specific reason." Callahan looked at the coin with something approaching reverence, understanding the weight of what was being offered. "That coin represents something," Monroe continued. "It represents commitment. It represents the understanding that leadership is not about personal power, but about service to those under your command. It represents the memory of Marines who sacrificed everything for their country. And I'm giving it to you because I believe you've genuinely learned what it means to be a Marine leader. Not because you don't have any more to learn, you have a lifetime of learning ahead of you, but because you've proven that you understand the fundamental principle. Your rank is not about you, it's about them." Callahan reached out and took the box, his hands trembling slightly as he held it. "Carry this with you," Monroe said. "Not necessarily on your person, though you can if you want to, but carry it with you in your memory, in your understanding of what it means to be a leader. Every time you're tempted to use your authority as a weapon, every time you're tempted to bully someone because you can, I want you to remember this coin. I want you to remember where it came from. I want you to remember the choice you made 6 months ago to change." Monroe stood, which signaled that the formal portion of the meeting was concluded. But he extended his hand across the desk, and when Callahan shook it, the grip was not the formal shake of a superior officer. It was the grip of one professional acknowledging another, one leader respecting another who had chosen the harder path. "You're going to be a good Marine, Callahan," Monroe said. "Probably a great one. The question is whether you'll continue to choose to be. That choice is now yours to make." 3 weeks later, General Margaret Thornton returned to the dining facility for the first time since the incident. She was in uniform, conducting what appeared to be a routine inspection of the facility, but everyone who had been present on that fateful day knew that this was something more significant. Sergeant Callahan was on duty, working the serving line, when he saw her enter through the main doors. His first instinct was to stand at attention, to come to the position of respect. Instead, he simply continued his work, serving food to the Marines in line, understanding that this was the real test, not the formal moments, but the everyday moments where he chose to do the right thing when no one was specifically watching. When General Thornton reached the point in the line where Callahan was working, she stopped. She was dressed in her Class A uniform, the same uniform she had worn during the disciplinary hearing. Her bearing was perfect, her expression composed but warm. "Sergeant Callahan," she said, extending her hand across the counter. "I wanted to take the time to personally observe your progress. I'm impressed with what I've heard from Gunnery Sergeant Monroe and Command Sergeant Major Monroe." "Thank you, General," Callahan replied, shaking her hand. "I want to thank you again for the opportunity to correct my mistake. I wouldn't have made it through the past 6 months without the structure and support you and Sergeant Major Monroe provided." "You gave yourself the opportunity," General Thornton corrected gently. "I provided the framework, but you did the work. You made the choice every single day to be better than you were the day before. That's all I can ask of any Marine." She picked up her tray and moved down the line, but before she reached the end, she turned back one more time. "Sergeant Callahan," she called out. "Yes, ma'am. I have a feeling we haven't seen the last of your career progression. Keep choosing to be a leader of character. That's the path to genuine success in this institution." As General Thornton walked toward a table near the back of the dining facility, Sergeant Callahan felt something settle inside him. A sense of peace, a sense of completion, a sense that he had been truly seen and truly accepted by someone who mattered, despite having made a serious mistake. He returned his attention to the next Marine in line, a young private who looked nervous about something. "What can I get for you today?" Callahan asked, his voice warm and encouraging. "Take your time, make sure you get what you need." The private visibly relaxed, surprised by the kindness in the tone. "Just some rice and gravy, Sergeant, and maybe some extra vegetables if you have them." "Absolutely," Callahan said, loading the tray with careful attention. "You know, good nutrition is the foundation of good performance. You take care of your body, and your body takes care of you in the field. Make sure you're eating well." The private smiled, nodded, and moved along, carrying his tray with a sense of being genuinely cared for. Across the room at her corner table, General Thornton took a bite of her salad and watched. She nodded to herself, satisfied with what she was seeing. A Marine who had learned his lesson. A Marine who had chosen to become better. A Marine who understood that leadership was not about the uniform or the rank, but about the character it represented and the choices one made to uphold it. She opened her notebook and made a single entry, a personal notation about Sergeant Callahan's progress. Then she closed the notebook and simply sat, eating her lunch, surrounded by hundreds of Marines who were now learning through observation what true leadership looked like. The base continued its operations. The sun moved across the sky. Duty rotations changed and recommenced. But in the dining facility at Camp Sterling, something profound had shifted. A Marine had been broken down and rebuilt. An institution had invested in someone's redemption. And a leader had learned that the greatest victories are not won through strength or authority, but through the transformation of those who come under your command. This was the story that would be whispered through the ranks for years to come, not as a warning about what happened to someone who made a mistake, but as an inspiration about what could happen when an institution chose to invest in the growth and development of its people. This was the story that would remind every Marine who heard it that redemption was possible, that second chances could be earned, and that character was the true measure of a leader. And in the years that followed, Sergeant Callahan would carry the coin that Command Sergeant Major Monroe had given him. He would carry it not on his uniform, but in his heart, in his memory, in every decision he made about how to lead those under his command. He would remember the dining facility. He would remember the shame. He would remember the choice to change. And he would pass that lesson on to every Marine he ever led, ensuring that the cycle of redemption and growth continued through the ranks of the institution he served. Because that was the true measure of a warrior, not the strength to dominate others, but the strength to humble oneself, to learn, and to grow into someone worthy of the rank they wore and the Marines they led. This is the story of how one confrontation became a lesson for an entire battalion. This is the story of how a general officer chose investment over destruction. This is the story of how a Marine learned that true leadership begins not with the power to command, but with the wisdom to serve. Up next, you've got 2 more incredible stories waiting on your screen. If this one hit you, tap to watch the next, and make sure you're subscribed with notifications on. Oh, and drop your city in the comments. I want to see where you're watching from.